Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my recent reading that does not include the mysteries, because we're getting a March Mystery Madness wrap-up later, or the Booktube Prize reading, because I'm in one of the nonfiction groups and that's been another chunk of stuff, and also not the graphic novels, because I think I'm going to separate that out because there are enough of them for now, because I'm going to start with a piece of graphic nonfiction. So first up is a book that I was not expecting to be as topical as it ended up being when I first picked it up, and this is Igort's work of comics journalism, the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks. This collects two books that were published as separate volumes in the original Italian. The Ukrainian section is him interviewing a series of survivors of the engineered famine of the 1930s, which is now widely internationally recognized as having been a genocide. The second half is about the work of Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian journalist who was murdered after, or assassinated, after revealing some of the war crime by the Russian military during the Second Chechen War. And then there's an afterword in here that's about the annexation of Crimea 2014. So all very topical in a way that I wasn't expecting it to be so immediately topical when I picked it up. I think if you are familiar with any of these events, this is useful in putting a kind of human face on it because he is interviewing specific people and talking to them about their own experiences. So if you're familiar with any of these things as sets of statistics, it's useful for that. I think if you don't know about any of these events, and I think a lot of people don't, I've seen a lot of discussions about what's happening in Ukraine now and about Russian military actions and that don't seem to know about both the longer history in Ukraine and also what the Russian military was doing during both the First and Second Chechen Wars. So well worth picking up if you're interested in learning about any of those or putting a human face on things that you already know. The art style varies a little bit. It's a very detailed and serious is probably the wrong way to describe this, but it is a respectful and very pencil style. Art style, not quite as detailed as some of Joe Sacco's work, because I know some people will approach his brand of comics journalism and feel like it's too much, and this is not quite that level of shaded detail. So I think if you are looking to read comics journalism and you don't like Sacco's style, even though I think he's kind of the godfather of that particular subgenre, this is also well worth picking up if you're looking for a different art style in comics journalism. Let's talk about some more depressing history. Next up, I read a book of short stories, and that was Scholastique Mukasonga's Igifu, which was translated by Jordan Stump, who I believe has translated all of the books of hers that Archipelago has put out. And there was a sale, so I picked up a couple of Archipelago books. These are all stories that are set at various points in modern Rwanda and all with Tutsi characters, and so what is hanging over all of them is the genocide of the 90s, as well as the massacre of the 60s, and then the displacements that happened in the 1970s. So regardless of which part of the late 20th or early 21st century that the stories are taking place in, that's always sort of hanging over them, even when the stories are not explicitly dealing with those things, although there are stories in here that are explicitly about people dealing with the displacement of the 70s. The final story is about a character going back to Rwanda after having survived the genocide because she had been overseas at the time and having a list of her family members and wanting to see where they died. If you have read some of Mukasonga's autobiographical work, she has a memoir both of her own life and then also of her mother's life, and if you've read those, you'll see bits and pieces of autobiographical inspiration in these, which is really interesting. Needless to say, given the setting and the topic, this is very depressing, but I think in a very human way, which, again, I think is, as with the other book, is a useful thing to think about, because, again, it is something where a lot of people have read about it in terms of numbers and are not necessarily thinking about people, unless, of course, you've read her memoirs, in which case you are thinking about it from a more human perspective, and maybe you'd like to pick this up to see where the memoir weaves its way into the fiction, because that's always fun too. It's definitely not autofiction, though she is very clearly writing about fictional people, but just some of the situations you see and can recognize, so that's kind of interesting. Let's go with some more depressing stuff. After that, I read John Steinbeck's The Red Pony, which is a series of 4 short stories that sort of form a novella, in that they're all following the same young boy on a farm in presumably the early 1930s in California. And this is a book that, the first story in this, I remember reading in school. And so I kind of had thought that this was a reread, although I think only the first short story was what I had read before, because the rest of it was all new to me. This is definitely depressing stories on the brink of the depression. It is, I think, in some ways, exactly the kind of thing you would think about. What's your stereotype of something that Steinbeck would write? And I think, as people expect when you see any story with an animal in the title, and you ask yourself, does the animal die? And the answer here is that so many animals die in this. And that's not really a spoiler, because what you were working through is the boy's reaction to all of the things that are happening. It's not particularly the things themselves. But it was funny because I posted about this on Instagram, and Brian from Bookish mentioned that he read this when he was younger and was still haunted by one of the things, and he didn't mention which one. And I said, oh, was it when the kid beats the buzzard to death? And he said, no. And I said, was it when the ranch hand bludgeons the mare to death? And he said, no. And it's the pony in the title. So yes, a lot of animals die in here, if that's a thing that you don't want to read in public. Although I would say in this, it is not presented as much as, this is not like something like Where the Red Fern Grows, where it's clearly telling a young audience, here's where you weep at the stuff where the people and the dogs are dying. This is not that kind of story. This is a very, not necessarily circle of life, the harshness of life is what this is about. And actually one of the stories is also about societal change and stuff, and that was really interesting. And maybe more memorable than the 3 animal death stories. I shouldn't be laughing. It's an interesting book. I would say well worth reading if you were like me and you've only read one of the stories because that was assigned reading when you were in school. I think it's well worth picking up because, yeah, I had thought I knew what that was about and I was only partially right. So yeah, good stuff. And while we're talking about books that are written in more or less the same era, I also read R.C. Sherriff's play Journey's End. This was a play that was originally produced in 1928. It's a First World War story, and it's really interesting to read this now because this is something that has had so much influence on just tons of the First World War stories that have worked their way into the whole modern memory, because just the scene at the end, reading it, you almost can't help but think of things like the Blackadder First World War section ending, because it's like that. When you look at the friendships, I can think of dozens of pieces of current day, like historical fiction written in the past 20 years, that use exactly the same dynamic, and it clearly all came from this. So reading it, you almost have to keep in mind that when this was written 90 years ago, this was the first of the first one to use a lot of those tropes, because reading it now, it's almost tempting to say, well, I've heard this story dozens of times in dozens of forms. And yes, but that's because this was so influential on everything else. So yeah, there's lots of people dying pointlessly. There's a lot of mud. Everyone's shell-shocked. You know the story, but I think it's well worth picking up in part for that, so that you can read it and think about and just be aware of how much influence this has had on other pieces of work. Like even, I was listening to, this is going to sound ridiculous, I was listening to Sabaton's new album, which is all songs about First World War things. And even if you watch like some of their music videos from that album or one of their previous ones that are also First World War songs, they're also songs about the First World War, a lot of that imagery is stuff that came out of work from the 1920s, from these actual guys, and that has worked its way into the common culture. So it's really interesting. It's a good play on its own, but it's interesting more for the way you can see how bits and pieces of it have made its way into so many other things. So that was very cool. And next up, I read something that a lot of people on Booktube and especially on Instagram have been talking about, and that is this book that says it's Toni Morrison's short story, let's call it Recitatif. And but half of the book is actually an essay by Zadie Smith explaining it. And I've seen a lot of very glowing reviews about this. I felt kind of lukewarm about it. I thought the essay itself, I thought Zadie Smith's essay was interesting. The short story itself just felt like a lot of portraits of people growing up and the kind of generation that came of age in the 60s. And the piece that I think that everybody talks about Morrison playing within this is that you have two characters who are in a group home or an orphanage at one point in their lives and then run into each other at a few later points in their life. A bunch of places I see people describe that as she doesn't reveal their race. That's not exactly true. We know that one of them is black and one of them is white, and we don't know which is which, but that's not the same as not knowing their race, because it makes a point early in the thing where it says, you know that they're not the upstate Indians, the New York City Puerto Ricans, or the couple of Koreans, right? They've narrowed it down. It's not that their race is never described, which I see everywhere, and that's not actually what it is. And I think the thing is, if you don't find that an interesting puzzle, it's kind of a generic people who came of age in the 1960s kind of story, and I didn't find that interesting, which I know is kind of sacrilege. So I thought it was interesting, especially with the essay that gives it the context and whatnot. But yeah, I wasn't that taken with it, but I think you have to be more interested in the puzzle of trying to figure out who is who, and I just wasn't that invested in that. It didn't, so sorry about that. But not everything is going to be interesting for everyone, so that's all right. Plenty of other people have loved and gushed about it. Anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. I assume lots of people will have liked this a lot more than I did, so that'll be interesting. And yeah, I'd love to hear if you've read Journey's End. Did you, what your experience of recognizing bits and pieces of how it worked its way into other things. That would be fun to hear about too. All right, that's it for now. Ciao.